So yeah, whenever you have open mesh and you Dynamesh, it will automatically close the mesh. That's one thing that happens between Maya and Zbrush. So, you know, for me, I would probably fill the box opening with some mesh, or make sure I didn't delete that edge. If you notice in this case, right, this object has a face with more than 4 sides. It's actually got 3 extra sides here, or 2 extra sides here, right? Zbrush does not like objects that have polygons that have more than 4 sides. So if I try to go Z this thing over, it'll either spit out an error or it'll just automatically put edges in, which is not bad. It's not the worst thing in the world to happen, but I usually like to kind of control the mesh that I'm dealing with. So, you know, in most cases when it comes to these objects, I plan on Dynameshing them for the most part. These are just my layout. So I'm going to just show you as I go through the progression a little bit. So these objects here, this thing, right, it doesn't have any defined polygons. So if I go Z this thing over just to show you the mesh, right, it's automatically going to put in some edges. So that may or may not be a problem. Remember with Dynamesh, right? This thing is kind of faceted, which basically means you can sort of see the polygons. So if I Dynamesh this thing, it's just going to look roughly the same, but oh no. So yeah, this mesh, like I said, even though I didn't have defined edges here, it's kind of putting some in. Yeah, what I was going to say is, you know, we're going to Dynamesh this thing, but one of the weird issues with this is that if you go into Dynamesh, right, and, you know, we're not at a super high resolution with Dynamesh, you're still kind of getting the hard edges there. So keep in mind, if you build something really, really low poly, it will still show up kind of low poly looking in your Maya scene. So if you need anything with a curvature or softness, you may need to divide the mesh. And of course, this doesn't divide well if we divide it. So there are a couple of little tricks we can do. Either we can go into Maya, let's say, and we just take our edge loops like so. Shift double click. There we go. Hopefully it'll reach over here. I'll just grab these. Okay, then we'll just deselect this stuff here. So let's shift double click on parallel edges to get a bunch of rings, which I call a ring of edges. And you can just bevel that to make it look a little smoother, right? Round it out a little nicer. Give it a little more curvature to start with. I have another trick though. So instead of doing that, we can also, so yeah, let me try to send this over and see what happens. So if I see that, you see it just kind of puts a bunch of parallel edges in, which isn't a bad thing. Again, let me just adjust my size on this thing down to 2. And then we can Dynamesh, right? So just Dynamesh it. And it looks a lot smoother, a lot better, right? Still not perfect, but it's okay. Something else we can do before we Dynamesh. This is another polygroup trick. So I mentioned this before. We have polygroups, and we can kind of group just based on the angle of the object. So if you hit binormals, it will basically split things automatically into groups. Now, I think this band across the top is going to be one big band. Okay. Right, so maybe if I adjust the angle down a little bit to like 25 instead. Oops, 25. Right, so now that top band is kind of split off. The side bands are split off. The front and back are split off, right? So now if I go back to geometry, Dynamesh, excuse me, there we go, right? There's a little extra cool trick to this. So we got polygroups. It looks still about the same, right? If you go into deformation, we've got things that work really well with polygroups. Polish by feature. It'll actually try to polish to the edges of the object, or we can actually go polish by groups. So it's literally going to try to smooth out and sharpen up that object based on the polygroups. Okay, so that's one other kind of cool trick that we can work around. Instead of like adding more mesh in Maya, just deal with it via polygroups and a bit of polish by groups. Like sometimes, yeah, if I'm building something with a sphere or whatever, like so. So let's say for whatever reason, I imported or start with a very, very low res sphere, okay? Like this. So I didn't think about it. I was like, oh, I got to smooth it out? Well, sometimes I will divide a mesh before Dynameshing just to get that smoothness into it. So divide a few times, and then I can Dynamesh. If it asks you to freeze, what that basically means is it's kind of going to store a snapshot of this model with subdivisions away and make it look like it has no subdivisions. Usually I don't like to freeze things, so I almost always tend to avoid freezing. There are some specific instances which we'll get to in more advanced classes, but usually I just say no, forget it, but just give me the smoothness, right? So now I get the smoothness without having to rework it via polygroups or whatever else, or smoothing by hand or by slider.